Good evening. My name is Giovanni, and welcome to another Wednesday night program. Today we are continuing our series on marriage with a conversation with Dorothy Greco. I met Dorothy 3 years ago when she came to speak at the Intentionally Placed Synergist Women's Conference. At that time, she came to talk about marriage, what makes marriage beautiful and healthy. She is the author of 2 books, Making Marriage Beautiful and Marriage in the Middle, and she has written extensively on the topic for Christianity Today, Relevant Magazine, and StartMarriageRight.com, as well as other publications. We are really excited to have this conversation with her because of her insight into couples, having counseled couples over the course of many years for premarital, postmarital counseling. And so this is a conversation that I hope you will enjoy and that you will learn a lot from. So let's get right into it. So Dorothy, welcome to the program. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
Awesome. Before we get started, I wanted to kind of read some biblical verses to sort of frame our conversation a little bit. And I'd like to read 3 verses specifically. The first one is from Ephesians 5:25, and it says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her." And then the next verse, we can find it on Genesis 2:24. "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And lastly, the third verse is found in 1 Corinthians 7:3. "The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband. Likewise does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." And I just thought these would be some great verses to kind of frame our conversation as we're talking about marriage, as we're talking about, the relationship, as we're talking about the different struggles, right, that happen in marriage. And so what I wanted to ask you, actually, is something that I've been wondering about. Why marriage? Why did you choose marriage as sort of your topic of research, of writing about, and so forth? Tell us a little bit how you came to that.
So my husband Christopher and I got married. We had a very rocky engagement relationship before we married. Mm-hmm. I was older. I was almost 31 when I got married. Let's just say we had some conflict. It wasn't the easiest relationship to enter into, in part because we're very different people. Yeah. We're both very strong-willed, very opinionated, you name it. Where does the Christmas tree go? What color do we want to paint the bathroom? We have opinions about everything. So I think we had to work at it much harder than maybe your average couple. And then as we became involved in pastoral ministry, when Christopher was on staff, mm-hmm. We were older, in our 30s. Mm-hmm. It was a young church. Many of the people were in their 20s, early married. And it became clear that they just needed help. They needed somebody to talk to. Mm-hmm. They needed to be able to process things. So I think we just naturally gravitated towards doing premarital classes, doing some marriage coaching, doing marriage conferences. And after doing that for 10 or 15 years, I thought, I feel like that I have more to say than simply the half an hour in this teaching. So I began to assemble all of my thoughts in one place. And the first book was 2017, and then the second book was 2020.
Yeah. Well, as you're talking about your relationship with Christopher, in fact, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and it was a question that I had for one of the couples that we invited onto the program mm-hmm. on the first part of the series. And it was asking them, they've been married 6 months. And so I had asked them, what made them, what led them to know that they were the right people for each other. And of course, they were both Christian at the time. Yeah. So it wasn't a case of, one was Christian and one was not. But, you've counseled a lot of couples over the years. And I'm sure you have some ideas as to, especially if there is someone out there who is listening or watching the program and wanting to make the best decision mm-hmm. in terms of, mm-hmm. Marriage. Marriage is a big decision. And so what are some of the things, sort of red flags, right, that someone, if they see that in their, boyfriend or fiance or whatever, what are some things that are important to work out? And it sounds like, right, as you and Christopher were working through some things, right, before you made the step to finally come together as husband and wife. And so is there anything, right, from your own experience that we could teach anyone who's considering marriage?
Yeah, maybe before I talk about red flags, I'll say that I'll share our philosophy, which is that we don't think that there's only one person in the world that you're destined to be married to, because that feels like an awful lot of pressure, and so if you are not in the right place at the right time, in the right mood, or you're going to miss the one person, we don't feel that way. But we do feel like that whoever you marry, you should feel like this is the only person for me. So just to make that little clarification. I think in terms of red flags, anybody who is seriously addicted and not dealing with the addiction or not, we would counsel people to say both spouses need to be sober before you come into a marriage. So if there's some addictions that are happening, our counsel would be work on the addiction, get sober before you get married. That would probably be one of the primary things. In terms of common ground, as I said, Christopher and I are very different. We have a lot of differences, but we are joined together by our faith in Jesus and by the fact that we believe with all of our heart that the goal of being a Christian is to learn how to love and to learn how to love and serve other people. So that's kind of a big umbrella, but that commonality has allowed us to stay connected and to grow, and then to find specific ways that we can partner together. I think that that's another important thing, is the notion of being able to come alongside of each other in a marriage and feel like there's a mutuality. There's not a hierarchy, like one person isn't up here and the other person is way down here. I think that makes an enormous difference in how the marriage is going to go. So that equality and mutual respect, I think, is also really important. And then maybe the last thing would be communication. How do you do in terms of talking to each other? Because communication styles are also very different. And you want to be able to feel like you can really reach across whatever gaps there are and have the kind of communication with your spouse that you get each other. So there's probably a lot more, but those are the three that just come to mind.
Okay. Yeah, the one of the things, and we joked about it on that program, in terms of like asking hard questions of your potential mate.
Yes.
And one of the things that she had asked him, any type of trauma in the family, that I should be aware of.
Yes.
And also people may have own kind of internal traumas that they haven't worked through. And so I think those are also some questions and some things to bring to the table. I think sometimes it's really hard for us to have those conversations with people that we care about. And so do you do premarital counseling as well?
We actually don't do it as much anymore. We had been doing it as classes, like as part of our church. I have written a premarital booklet that people could get to go through. But I think that you're absolutely right. The notion of do you know what your history is? What history are you bringing into your marriage? Anybody who's a sexual abuse victim, like that's going to really impact your marriage. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get married, but it does mean that you have to carry an awareness of what is this going to look like in the context of our marriage, and are we aware of, you never know everything, right, until you're 5, 10, 15 years in, but the notion of, oh, this is on our radar, I think is, so I'm so glad that you brought that up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and this program, part of the goal of this program is definitely to help people as they are married, right? What are some of those things that could trip you up? What are some of the problems that arise as you stated, right, 5, 10 years into the marriage, those things that might pop up. But you said something interesting. I was listening to a few of the programs that you've done in the past, and you said that following Jesus is supposed to change every area of our lives, including marriage. Could you kind of expound a little bit on that?
We could talk about that for hours. Yes, I mean, again, our fundamental belief is that anytime somebody says yes to Jesus, what they're saying is, I'm laying down my life for the sake of the gospel, right? And so whatever God asks of us, we're saying yes, hopefully again and again. There's many invitations. in the context of following after Jesus, we think that the goal is to get holy, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what the scripture talks about, Hebrews, right? That he wants, God calls us into a space of holiness. So if we're called into holiness, then what does that mean? That means that we get rid of our besetting sins. That means that we throw off everything that hinders us. Maybe it's not a sin, but a choice of, that program really doesn't serve me. When I watch that program, I kind of get a little apathetic. I get a little sarcastic. So maybe I need to not watch that. So we're constantly aware of, not in a like overly morbid or self-reflective way, but we're thinking, how does the whole of my life point me towards Jesus? And then we do that together as a couple, right? So that as we are becoming one, which is a process, right? It starts the day that we make the commitment.
And
but
I'm glad
it
you
doesn't,
said that it is a process.
Totally a process, and I believe it's a process that continues until the Lord calls one of us home. So that pursuit of Jesus, the pursuit of holiness, the pursuit of what does it look like to love this person really, really well, has to change us, because we tend to be egocentric people, selfish. I mean, I know I am. So as, we've been married for almost 33 years now. So in the context of pursuing God and trying to love my husband well, I think that the changes that I've seen in myself, first I want to say, it takes a long time to change. Change is really slow, but I do see changes. I see that I'm more kind, that I'm more patient, that I'm more willing to serve Christopher in ways maybe even that stretch me, the ways that I wouldn't necessarily think of doing it, but because I know it's meaningful to him, I will stretch to serve him and to love him. Yeah, I really love that, that marriage is a process. And that leads me to actually, as you were talking about process, and I touched upon this a little bit when we were talking about doing the program today, the life cycle of marriage, of a marriage, or marriages have a life cycle. If you've never heard of that, there is an author, I think DeMaria, psychologist, and he sort of categorized these 7 stages of the life cycle of a marriage. And I'll go through them pretty quickly at first, and then I want to touch upon each one, as it has some bearing into parts of the discussion that I want to engage in with you. And so passion is the first stage, and this is, of course, the honeymoon stage. And then there's the realization from 1 to 2 years of marriage, the rebellion phase from 3 to 10 years of marriage, cooperation, 10 to 20 years of marriage, reunion, 20 to 30 years of marriage, explosion, 15 to 35 years of marriage, and then completion, 35 plus. And I'm going to I love that the explosion is like, we have a 20-year window for an explosion. Like, okay.
And so, it's good to use it as a framework, just because of all the things that as I was reading about the life cycles of marriage, and of course, passion. It sort of seems common sense to me, right? Sort of the beginning of the marriage, when everything is new. There are no sex issues, right? That
depends.
It does depend. It does depend. But it's that honeymoon phase, right, when everything is new. And I could see it in our couple that's been married for 6 months. That there was just like this newness about everything. And then now the realization, and I want to talk to you specifically about this. This is where, and this is 1 to 2 years of marriage, as categorized by this author. And it says this is where when the conflict begins, right? The differences between the couples begin to kind of bubble up and make themselves more apparent. And then a certain level of disappointment. And you've written a lot about this, and then disappointment being tied to kind of unrealistic expectations. Yes. So I want to ask you what, sort of those unrealistic expectations that we may have of our spouses that lead specifically, during these stage where we're finding out, well, this person, I didn't realize that you were like this. Right. I didn't realize you did this, right? And so to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'll back up a little bit and say, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and our childhood was all Disney movies, right? And if you think about Disney movies back then, they're much better now, but back then, all the girls or women waited. They served in a very sort of servant kind of a way. They were often singing. right?
Right.
And very passive. They were waiting for something to come to them. And then when the prince came, he saved everything. Everything was perfect when the prince came. I didn't know that I was Disney-fied. I didn't realize that I was coming into my marriage with these expectations of, the prince on the horse coming in to save me. Like, that's not my personality.
Yeah.
But somehow those cultural beliefs just kind of infiltrated my thinking in a way that, as I look back now, I'm sort of surprised that I was fooled by that.
Yeah.
But I think what that meant is we came into marriage seeing each other as equals, and yet there were ways in which that I was deferring to him and expecting him to lead in certain areas. So Christopher has ADHD, and anything that I say about him, he has okayed me saying. So I don't want anybody, because he's not here, to think I'm throwing him under the bus. So he knows that we talk about this stuff. He has executive functioning issues, which we didn't quite understand when we started the marriage, and because of when he was born, that wasn't something that was diagnosed at that time. So I'm leaning in, thinking like, okay, so when are you going to, fill in the blank, initiate prayer? Where for him, he's got so much going on in his head that it's hard for him to focus on a particular thing on a regular basis. So he's very spontaneous, which I love that about him. But what that means is that we didn't have regular prayer for a long time. And I noticed that I was getting really irritated with him. Like, why aren't you doing this? Like, I think you're supposed to do this. And it was year 10, that was our explosion. So we were a little early, didn't quite make it to 15. Where we really had sort of a come to Jesus conversation where we were talking about like, him saying, I feel like you're expecting things from me that I can't give you. And it's not that I don't love you, and it's not that I'm not faithful, but you're expecting things of me, of my personality, that I'm unable to give you. And we need to talk about that, because I feel like a failure, and I'm not a failure.
Right.
And that was like, that was a really hard conversation, because he was right. And I needed to recalibrate and to say, okay, so if he's not the type of person who's going to initiate on a regular basis, but I can, why am I not? Like, why am I deferring to him?
Right.
So I think in those moments when we realize that we're disappointed, what we need to do is trace the disappointment back to the expectation. So what was the expectation here? And if the expectation is godly, like fidelity, we can't let go of that, right? That is something that we have to fight for and hold on to. But I think many of our expectations that we bring into marriage in any relationship are very culturally bound. They're not moral, they're cultural. So what does it look like for us to be able to parse that out and to say, you know what, that's not really that important? Or for me in this situation, saying, I seem to like to pray more one-on-one than you do, Christopher. So why don't I call my girlfriends and we'll get together to pray? And then he doesn't feel this judgment and pressure from me, and I can get that need met. Obviously, like, we have to be careful. Like, I don't want to pray with a man because there's an intimacy there. But I think for us to realize this person who I love and who I've committed my life to is unable, or sometimes it's unwilling, and that's a little bit harder, but is unable to do the thing that I want him to do. And if it's, again, not a question of morality, then how do we negotiate that? How do we let go of the expectations that are unrealistic and come into a place of reality so that we can enjoy each other and not be in conflict so much?
Okay. So your recommendation would be, if you are disappointed and maybe bitter, it's to really think, where is the source of that disappointment and that bitterness? And to have an honest and open discussion with your spouse about, and so how long does that work take? And obviously, there may be some people who don't even realize, the source of their disappointment and bitterness. Where is this coming from?
I think first we have to recognize, what does disappointment look like for us? Because it's different for everybody. Like, some people might get mad, some people might might withdraw. I notice when I'm sarcastic, that typically is a flag for me that there's something eating at me that I haven't gotten to. So if we do that work to say, I'm disappointed, what was the disappointment connected to? What was my expectation? And then to try to figure out, is this a realistic expectation based on who I married, right? Not what I want, but based on who I married, is this a realistic expectation? And, this might be like super, super discouraging. Those kind of things take decades. They do. Because some of the things that we want and feel important to us, it's just really hard to let go of them.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. There was something else too that you've talked about, the role of self-awareness in during this time when you feel disappointed. Can you talk a little bit about that, or sort of being self-aware? And I guess it goes back to, as you said, kind of having some sense or doing the homework that you need to do to figure out where it is that the disappointment and the bitterness is coming from, right? To be self-aware, or the self-awareness maybe come after you've done some of that work to figure out the source.
Probably both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think probably it's just an ongoing thing. For me, self-awareness is very connected to the search me, Lord, and know me, right? It's inviting the Holy Spirit to come in. So for me, what that looks like is the daily examine, and being able at the end of the day to just go before the Lord in humility and say, are there moments in this day that I hurt somebody? Are there moments in this day when I was rude to my husband, or when I was impatient with one of my kids, right? Early on, that was a biggie. And then being able to take that and say, okay, well, what do I do with that? And with Christopher, we have a habit of just confessing our sins to each other. So that might just mean turning to him and saying, you know, I think that I owe you an apology for how I treated you at dinner tonight. I'm really sorry. Period. No explanation. No, this is why I did it. And if you hadn't done this, but just simple, I'm sorry that I treated you poorly. So having an openness to the Holy Spirit bringing conviction, even if the sin is small, right? Because that's not like I didn't have an affair. I just was rude to him for 30 seconds. And I think it's really easy for us as married couples to dismiss those moments. But if we bring them to each other in humility and apologize, I think what happens is we repair. And we always want to be repairing. So that we can easily move towards each other.
Yeah, I love that idea of repairing, because I feel as though sometimes, in marriage, those little things that might not seem like that big a deal, and we don't apologize for, can really chip away. It's like the drop of water, right? Over time, it makes a hole. It can make a hole in the marriage. And so, as you say, sort of asking for our spouse's forgiveness for what, and vice versa. Yeah,
and another question that I think Christopher and I ask each other, what's it like to be married to me? In this particular season, what's it like to be married to me? Of our carrying an awareness of what is my besetting sin, and how does that affect my spouse? What are a few of, I wish that I just had one, greatest limitations, and how do my limitations affect my spouse? And if we can walk in an awareness of that, again, I think it just like eases our spouse's burden. I'll just give you a quick example. So I've had chronic health issues for 23 years now, and that affects every single part of our marriage. And if I'm having a day where my pain is really, really high, sometimes it feels like it takes all of my energy just to get through my day, and I don't feel like I have a whole lot to give to him. And I didn't realize this early on, but if I don't tell him that, he might think like, gosh, why is she being so weird today? So just my saying, I'm having a really high pain day, and please don't take it personally, then he can just relax and think, okay, it's not me. So that kind of self-awareness, our limitations and our sins, how does it affect our spouse, I think is a really, really helpful way to frame thinking about this.
I want to talk about the rebellion stage, just because this particular stage, which takes place between 3 to 10 years, with 7 and 8 being the most dangerous. And one of the things that I learned is the average year in which people divorce is the 8th year.
Interesting.
The 8th year. So I think I had heard a long time ago that it was 10, but that seems to be going down, and it's 8 is what I read. But this particular stage, this rebellion stage, is characterized and with our individualistic culture, right, and self-actualization, and we're an individual, and my growth is important, and my expression is important. That we can bring that into the marriage. And so at this stage in particular is characterized by a self-interest where the spouse is more interested in sort of themselves than in the health of the marriage.
Interesting.
The bitterness can set in here, as well as potentially infidelity during this stage. And again, 8 years is that watermark year when potentially there could be a divorce. But I want to specifically, during these years, the role of self-sacrifice, right? And the sacrificial kind of love. And we talked about the verses in the past, right? Just the way that Christ loved the church, how that might play into this, these years of self-interest, but by the spouse or each person in the marriage.
So because I told Giovanni before we started, this is a new concept to me, these stages. When they talk about rebellion, do they mean from the marriage, from each other? Or
maybe from the expectations of the marriage, or, there's more focus on the self than on the relationship together.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think you're absolutely right that we do live in a very individualistic culture, and even the notion of self-awareness, like self-awareness to me, that's not where it stops, right? That's where it starts, and then the self-awareness should bring us into deeper relationship with God and a deeper relationship with our spouse. So in my second book, Marriage in the Middle, I talk about a time that was now, I don't even remember how long it was, 10, 12 years ago, when so many things happened that were really brutally difficult. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer and died within 6 weeks. Our eldest son went off to college. We got bed bugs on the way home. Our neighbor had a tragic accident and died. They were just like, I didn't want to go out of the house. Like, that's how it felt, like so overwhelming to me. And neither of us had much to give to each other. But what we had to do in that space was to say, yes, we are depleted. We don't have much to give. But what's one thing that I can do? How can I reach across? So my prayer every morning was, Lord, help me love my husband. Yeah. And that seems really small, but again, it just sort of oriented me towards him and what he needed, because I knew that he was hurting too. Yeah. And I think that, I don't know if you feel this way, but there's a level where we have to be willing to trust the Lord to resource us, even when we're out of gas. Right. To be able to say, God, I don't have it. Like, I don't have it in me to love my husband right now, but I believe that you, as the originator of love, will give me what I need. And so here I am, fill me up, and give me what I need so that I can love him well.
And I think it's so important, what you're saying, because these are sort of, stages, right? But as Christians, right? I think our relationship with Christ and the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, right? Yes. These things kind of mean nothing. It's sort of some general things that can happen in these years, but the narrative with us having Christ in our lives makes this, it's very different, right? Yes. And makes our marriages look very different from what a different,
hopefully,
yes, hopefully. And so the role of the Holy Spirit, the role of humility, the role of sacrifice, the role of coming to the Lord and having God as the center of our lives, right? And always asking God to show us doing those examines, doing those, being self-aware about our sins and our own limitations and our shortcomings. And we can just bring those things to the Lord for him to help us.
Yeah, and even, I don't know if it's okay to talk about forgiveness, in this beat, but I think that during this time, like when there are offenses, when we have been hurt, and if you have a marriage where you haven't been hurt, God bless you, but I don't know many people for whom that's true. We hurt each other, even though we don't mean to. So the notion of really being clear about extending forgiveness, somebody apologizing fully, not like sorry, but I'm sorry for the specifics, and then the other person being able to say, I forgive you, or I'm still really angry, but I will work towards forgiveness and I will communicate with you how I'm doing in it. Again, I think, if we don't do that, things pile up. And the pile up can get so big that we lose sight of each other.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what, these stages, obviously, like, I feel like self-interest and bitterness and that infidelity builds on those, the first and 2 years, unaddressed issues, then get worse and worse. And so I think we don't want to get to a point where these things are unaddressed in our own marriages with our spouse, but we want to come to the Lord, and we want to come to one another in honesty, right? And allow God to, and the Holy Spirit, to do the work in us.
Yeah, I don't think that, I don't know whether you agreed with this, but I don't think that people wake up one morning and say, I'm going to have an affair today.
Right.
I think it's a gradual process of turning away, of letting your heart grow cold or hard. And then the ultimate decision, is down the road. It's not an instantaneous thing.
Yeah, and one of the things that I read too is, infidelity isn't about sex. Infidelity is about looking or searching for something, that closeness that you are lacking.
Validation, affirmation,
all of these things. And so I want to talk about the next stage, cooperation, because it touches on some of the things that you've talked about in the past. And so at this stage of a marriage, people have kids, young children. They are developing in their careers. There's a busyness that sets in. And so one of the things that the author points out is that distance may be, or actually, I think what he said specifically is that the marriage begins to feel more like a business partnership, where you're the kids and getting
interactions,
interact, as opposed to a marriage, and there is a certain level of distance that can build. Can you sort of talk a little bit about that level of distance that sometimes builds in a marriage, and what people can do about that? Obviously there are things that each has to do as parents, and there are demands on their time and their energy and all of that, and oftentimes intimacy, is one of the things also that kind of goes by the wayside, because there's just no time, or people are tired.
Legitimate.
That's our legitimate reasons. But what are it? Talk to our parents who are so busy, and where if there is maybe some distance that they're feeling, it's like, well, what can I do? We're all both busy and we have kids. What can they do? To not let a chasm get bigger and bigger and bigger.
I guess the first thing I would say is notice it. And be bothered by it. Because if you don't notice it, or if you dismiss it and think like, oh, it's not important, it will be important, right? And there are seasons where we just don't have the energy to give to each other, like chronic health issues. A friend of ours just had a stroke, and she's in her 60s. So all of a sudden that's a game changer, right? In terms of what their marriage looks like. So I guess noticing it, being grieved by it, like sensing this is not the way it should be, will help to reorient back. Simple little things, I think, make a huge difference. I have a tendency not to smile. So when I was younger, I have dimples. I was teased like unrelentingly. And so at some point when I was like 7 or 8, I just decided, I'm not going to smile anymore. I'm not going to give them reason. And that has carried over my whole life. And so early on in our marriage, Christopher would come home and say, like, you never smile when I come in the door. And I'd think, of course I'm smiling. I felt happy to see him, but I didn't communicate it on my face. So little thing. Hugging for more than 5 seconds. A minute hug. There's something that happens there even physiologically when we're connected with someone physically that just helps us. Like, we can, if you pay attention, when you hug somebody you really love for that long, you can actually feel your body just relax a little bit. And then you reference sex. Like, for us, we do believe that intimacy, provided people are healthy, because that's not the case for everybody, if you're able to be having sex, that is something that should be prioritized. I don't want to say how often, because I think that's a really unique and organic thing that people have to work out. I also think that the average that they talk about includes college boys, so I'm not beholden to the average as I read about it. But whatever it is that you feel like as a couple, this works for us, whether it's twice a week or once a week or twice a month. I think if it gets longer than several months, to me that's potentially a sign that there's something that's a little bit off. Years ago we sat down with friends, really good friends, and we could tell that there was something that was off, and she had made just this little comment about intimacy, and I kind of leaned in and said, well, what do you mean when you say that you're not having enough sex? And she said, well, we hadn't had sex for 5 years. And I just thought, oh man, you guys are in trouble. And they divorced within the next year. So I think that can be a symptom of an unwillingness to be present to each other. And like everything else in marriage, sex takes work. And I do want to say, the older that I get, the more complicated sex is. Like, it's not a linear thing anymore, but it's also richer. It's deeper. There's more trust that Christopher and I have with each other. So it's really been beautiful to see how sexual intimacy is still important to us even as we age.
And so even prioritizing intimacy, even during those seasons.
Put it on the calendar. It's not very sexy. Put it on the calendar.
And let's talk a little bit, since we've already kind of gone there. What is the role of sex in a marriage?
That's a deep question. I think that the giving over of our bodies to each other is a sacrifice. It is. So there is something that's deeply holy and sacrificial about yielding to each other. When I think sex is good, healthy, and whole, there's an honoring of each other's bodies, an honoring of each other's process. There's respect that happens, right? If there's something that goes on in the midst of sex and somebody says, whoa, like you're going too fast, or that doesn't feel good, for the other person to say, oh, absolutely, and not just push forward, like that communicates respect and trust. And then I think that it really builds oneness, right? There is something very mysterious. It's not simply a physical act. There's something that happens between us when we are really sharing our bodies and we're completely trusting of each other. That's bonding, and again, it releases hormones, and the hormones that it releases are bonding hormones. So I think God knew what he was doing when he created us.
And so for our parents out there, make sure that you're putting it on the schedule, that you're prioritizing it, because it is important. It is an important part of your relationship. And so what if, what would you say to somebody who is, or they have different expectations around frequency and things like that? And I know you talked about coming to some kind of agreement, right? There may be, part of the culture says that we have to, we sacrifice for our spouse. And so this may be an instance where someone says, well, she or he, wants to be intimate and I don't, but I'm going to do it, to please him or to do it for him. What would you say around, those?
I think that's happened for us on multiple occasions. Like Christopher wants to be intimate. I really would rather go to bed with a book, but I'm willing to love him. I'm willing to love him and willing to say yes. I think if that's the norm, that's problematic. Like if one person is just saying, yeah, I'll do it, but not like, let's do it. Right. There is potentially something there that's an indicator that maybe there's problems. Trust problems, could be physical problems. Again, for me, one of the big changes is that my body just, things don't feel the same after menopause, after having a child, right? So there's lots of issues that can happen that can cause distance there. I think one of the big issues in our culture now is that men can have a tendency to expect, and this is, I think, within the church, like they use that passage as leverage to say, you're supposed to give your body to me. Well, that's not very loving. I think that's not very loving to use that in a way that pressures a spouse. So I would say that anytime there is that sense of entitlement, that needs to get checked.
And those are the kinds of things that we need to, kind of bring under the command of the Holy Spirit, right? Because He's ultimately, right, the head of our marriage.
Right, exactly.
And so some, some of those things, if someone is feeling that way, there may be a conversation that needs to be had about, yeah.
Yeah, we feel like, Christopher and I feel like it should be mutual. Like 95% of the time, it should be a mutual, like, I want to. Yeah. And if it's not, like for us, the way that we've worked around that is because it's me most of the time with my high pain levels, if I don't feel capable of being intimate because of pain, he's completely, just let me know when you're ready.
Yeah. That's really lovely. So let's talk a little bit about the next stage, which is reunion. And at this point, the kids are a little bit older. They require less of the parents. Finances tend to be more stable. This is 20 to 30 years in the marriage. And now the problem that arises here is closing that intimacy gap that has formed, over the last 4 or 5 years. And now you've been married how long?
It'll be 33 years in 6-7 weeks. Yeah.
6 and 7 weeks. Now, would you say you're more you're closer to your husband now than you were in your earlier years?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's much more trust that's been built, like over all these years when he has been so faithful, so present, so kind to me. Like in particular, I think of, some husbands would have left their wives if they had to face what he has faced with my health issues. And his kindness, I think, has really been a tremendous form of love and healing for me in the midst of it. And again, we work at it. Several years ago, when we were doing a half-day conference and I was telling a friend from church about it, they had been married, 25 or so years, and she said, oh, we've been married 25 years. I don't think we need anything. We don't need any input. We're good. And I remember thinking, seriously? Like, is that really possible?
Right.
And compare that. 2 years later, we did another conference, and during the lunch break, I sat down with a couple who was older, and when I say older, I mean in their 80s. To be careful about that. And I assumed they had both been widowed and, were coming because they had just remarried. And so when I was talking with them at lunch and said, like, well, why did you come? And he said, today is our 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
And when we heard about this conference happening, I said to my wife, I want to go. There's always more for us to learn. Yeah. And I just thought, I want to be like them when I'm in my 80s, right? I want to feel like there's still more growth. There's still more for us to learn. And because I think that the Lord designed us to keep growing and to keep changing, we have to keep changing as a couple. Because if it's just one person changing over here and the other person changing over here, then we are going to go separate ways. So there has to be a tremendous intentionality to keep coming back together.
Yeah. So when you've counseled couples in the past who may be going in different directions, right? And there's sort of distance that has built. What are some of the things that you have counseled those couples? Some practical things that you've counseled for those couples to do together, or to rebuild that level of intimacy that that may be going out the window at that point.
Well, just to make the obvious comment of, it's a different category if we're talking about abuse or abandonment or neglect. So that's something completely other. So I'm not going to think that that's part of what we're talking about here.
Exactly.
So I think for people, first and foremost, to figure out, are there unconfessed sins? Whether those are big sins, I've been involved with pornography for the past 10 years and I haven't told you. To me, that's a big sin. Or little sins. I've been holding resentment against you for the past 5 years. So that the slate gets clean, and that might take years, particularly if there are major hidden sins. And if they then come into the light, that's hard work, right? So to be completely clear with your sins, to really go deep with forgiveness, and again, that's a process too, right? Like we can say, I forgive you, but sometimes the hurts get triggered, the resentment gets triggered, and then we have to go back and say, okay, there's more. We have to have another conversation. We have to go deeper here. Asking for help, I think, is really, really important. And again, in our individualistic culture, I think there's can be shame about going to a counselor.
Yeah.
But sometimes we need somebody who's objective. We need not just our friend who's going to say, oh, it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. You guys are doing fine. We need somebody to say, that's a problem, and let me help you work through it.
Yeah, yeah. Or friends will say, you're right and they're wrong.
Right.
Because there is that too.
Yes.
Some of our friends, unfortunately, are not helpful in our.
Well, they want to be supportive, and it maybe feels a little too dicey to say, yeah, I think you do that.
This has all been so incredibly helpful. So the last one of the explosion stage, so 15 to 35 years of marriage, and this is the empty nest at this point, and so staying together for the kids become less of a priority.
Yes.
And so this too is a stage where you have seen a lot of marriages sort of dissolve, particularly in the baby boom generation. After the kids are gone, it's like, and they've the chasm and the distance hasn't been repaired, and it's been building up over years and years, and they're like, well, let's just get the kids out of the house and then we can go our separate ways. That tends to happen. At this stage, and one of the reasons I asked you your question about you and your husband, being a lot closer at this stage. As we age, right, and our bodies change, and all of these things are different, and how do we continue to grow in our marriage as we age?
Again, I think holding the concept of a growth mentality, really key. So that we're not giving up, we're not settling into a rut, which I think that's a lot of what happens, like 50s and on. We have a sense of like, okay, we're good. Our relationship is good enough. Good enough is okay, but like, why stop there? Like, if you can have a relationship that's really dynamic, where you're really loving each other in a way that is bringing the kingdom of God to the earth, it's exciting. Like, it's exciting when that happens. So having the growth mindset, I think having a specific telos, I talk about that in Marriage in the Middle, and what I mean by that, it's a Greek word, and it essentially means it's a destination, but it's not simply like the point on the map. It's who are you traveling with? How do you go on the trip? What's the trip itself look like? How do you treat each other as you move toward that goal? So being able to say as a couple, I really believe that every single couple has something unique that they can offer. And that doesn't necessarily mean a worldwide ministry where you're reaching millions of people. It could just mean you look across the street and think like, gosh, my neighbor's wife died last month. Why don't we invite them over for dinner? Could be really simple little things. Seeing you've been married for 5 years and somebody just got married last week, and you say, why don't you come over for dinner? And then you allow them to ask any questions that they want to ask. Those kind of ministry together things, I think, put our problems in perspective and maybe reduce them a little bit, and gives us a sense of purpose and calling outside of ourselves that can be really helpful, dynamic, allow us to have sort of God's mentality a little bit more.
I really love that word that you use, the dynamic, a dynamic marriage. And so one of the things that I've, as I've read and, marriages that I have seen in the past, and even the way that marriages are portrayed in the media, right? It's a very dysfunctional kind of marriage, or it's like you basically are in a marriage and you grin and bear it, even though you're super unhappy, and or it's easier to stay married than to separate, kind of thing, and just like an acceptance of mediocre and not dynamic, marriage. And so, as you were talking, because I feel like sometimes, there may be our own internalized story about, I have to stay married even if I'm miserable, or accept, right, the condition of my marriage. And so how do you talk with a spouse or, someone who is listening, that we don't need to accept a marriage that that's not fulfilling, that
Yeah.
we can, there's something that we can do, right? That the story of a marriage, right, the dynamism, and that God intends is for fulfillment in
Yes.
all areas,
Yes.
right, of our marriage,
Yes.
whether, personal, sexual, what have you, that marriage is supposed to be something so incredibly beautiful,
Yes.
right, that we don't need to accept miserable marriages. Of course, granting that there's no abuse, that
Right,
there's
right.
nothing else, right? But talk a little bit about that. Just, this idea of God created marriage,
Yeah.
and He created it to be something that's just incredibly beautiful for men and women.
Well, first, let me debunk the myth that 50% of marriages end in divorce. That statistic is wrong. It has never been true. Even at the height of divorce in the 80s, it was never 50%.
Yeah.
So the reason that feels important is because if you go in and think, well, I only have a 50-50 chance, and so if
Yeah.
it doesn't work, like, no big deal, I'm just, on the average,
Yeah.
that's not true. And I did my own little survey of like 200 couples, and for people who are really pursuing Jesus,
Yeah.
like serious about Jesus, not just saying that they're Christian as opposed to Hindu or Buddhist, but Jesus is the
Yeah.
center of their lives, the divorce rate was like 10. And I think that that's more accurate. So I just want to make that, put that out there to say, I think that there is great hope for all of us. I would also say that probably the most difficult thing is if one spouse is really, really engaged and really, really wanting to change and to make the marriage wonderful, and the other is like indifferent. I think that's a really, really painful thing, and I want to validate that for anyone for whom that's true. I think that takes a tremendous amount of spirituality to stay in that space and to love, to not check out, to not grow bitter, to not be resentful, but to really say, I'm going to stay and I'm going to keep loving.
Yeah.
That there's something that's very beautiful about that. I really believe that the Lord wants a marriage to be mutually fulfilling. Like not just one person is happy, but that both people are filled with joy, are filled with wonder, are filled with love, are willing to sacrifice. And again, it just is a sense of re-upping, whether it's on your anniversary every year that you look back and you think like, where did we go off the rails this year? Where did we have a hard time this year? Where did we see God move this year? Taking the time to remember, just as the Israelites remembered in their, I think the Jewish people are much better at remembering things than the Christian church. That feels important to be able to see where has God been moving in us, and then to be able to maybe identify what are the places where we need some shoring up. What are the things that are not going well? Where are the places that I feel disconnected from you on a regular basis, and how can we think about repairing those if it's repair, or just maybe tweaking some behaviors. Christopher and I, one of the conversations we just had this week, Sunday evening is always our calendar night, very sexy. We just bring out the calendars and say what's happening this week, and it was more important when the kids were younger, when there was a lot more flux. But even just that, the simplicity of that, so that we're on the same page, and then looking out at, well, what do you need from me this week? Not just like who needs to pick up the dry cleaning and who's doing the grocery shopping, but what are the challenges that you see that you're going to be facing this week, and how can I come alongside of you to support you? It's a really little question, and it might simply be, you know what, I would really appreciate it if you would send me a text every day to tell me you're praying for me, so that I know you're here, you're with me, you're thinking about me. Those kind of things can be so important for us.
When you say it, it seems so simple, right? But maybe for a marriage to get to that point, right, there's a lot of work that needs to happen, ahead of that. And so, what I'm hearing from you, and even from, what I read, is that it's work, right?
It is work.
And it is communication.
Yes.
Right? You have to be willing to have those conversations with your spouse and come to agreement. I love this idea of kind of checking in, maybe quarterly even, where did we, not wait, a year, though a year is it's better than none at all.
Right.
But having those check-ins, with your marriage, praying with each other, asking God to show you the areas that that you both need work on. I think part of what you're saying is, you want to make sure that the growth that's happening in the marriage is happening together.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And bringing other people in, I think, is also really important. We have several friends for whom we have given explicit permission to call us on things if they see something that is troubling to them. And I think that that's really important for us to have those kind of relationships where there's trust and mutual honesty. People know us enough that they can say, I think that there's something weird happening with you guys right now. And can we talk about that? Can we help you process that? Those are really hard conversations. And I think that we can tend to feel like, ooh, I don't want to go there. But we need each other. Like we need to be able to have those kind of conversations to help each other make it through.
Yeah. And you're talking about sort of other couples who are accountability partners, kind of, for your marriage.
Or single people. We have given single people permission to do that too.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's, it's just anyone, right, who has an insight into the both of you.
Right.
And can see, I can see how that would be. Now, I wanted to kind of go back a little bit and talk about sort of the expectations, around sex because of the cultural context. And you touched on it a little bit with pornography. I just want to, we'll touch upon that, but just kind of this cultural milieu in which we live that is so sexualized, right? Where everything and anything goes. We're talking about pornography. There's lots of articles on open marriages. There's polyamory now that has, come to the surface. And so how have you seen some of these things? And pornography, obviously, has impacted marriages, including, Christian marriages.
Yes.
But some of these other kind of ideas, right, percolating out in the world, how do you see those things impacting Christian marriages or impacting the way that people are viewing their marriages nowadays?
It seems as if there's much more permissiveness to explore what you need. If you're not getting your sex drive fulfilled, then go outside of the marriage. And I wonder how much that happens for people who are really intimate with Jesus versus those who are just cultural Christians. I don't know that people splice that out when they talk about it. But certainly polyamory, they talk about that. The amount that it's in the media makes me think, is it really that common? Or is that something that just feels a little salacious and they think like, ooh, that'll get some readers in? I don't know. But I think the notion that a couple could be completely monogamous throughout the entirety of their marriage, to me is so obvious. Like, why would I want to go outside of our marriage to have sex? I can't even imagine kissing anybody else, really. And that is so breaches trust that takes such a long time to repair. So the notion that if we deviate from what the Lord talks about in Scripture, one man, one woman for the entirety of their marriage together, if we go astray from that, we're going to pay for it. And I don't think the culture talks about that. We talk about it as if, again, you deserve to have whatever sex you need, or if you don't feel fulfilled in your marriage, then you should go outside of your marriage and have your whatever sex you want. I just think that is so ridiculous.
And counter to God's intent for marriage. And
so damaging. So damaging.
Right. And I think that's some of what I've read, particularly sort of polyamory. There's these issues of jealousy and that come up.
How could it be a good thing? How could it be a good thing to see your spouse with somebody else? I just cannot imagine why that would be a good thing.
And I had a question here where we sort of talked about it a little bit. Should married people be complacent with a mediocre sex life if there is nothing physically wrong with either partner?
I think you're missing out on what's really rich and wonderful and beautiful and sexually satisfying. So to be complacent, to me, though I understand it, again, with somebody who has health issues, who really battles pain and fatigue, I can understand how someone could choose complacency if there's been conflict in the bed. I can understand how someone would choose complacency, but again, I think there's a lot that could happen that is beautiful and good and healing. There have been a number of times as we were making love that I just burst into tears, not because something was wrong, but because like the intimacy and the connectedness that we had in the moment just like opened up my heart to get access to something that was painful. Those are really beautiful moments. We can't plan for them, but I think if we hold on to the expectation that the Lord wants to bless us in our marriage bed and to do whatever work we need to do in order to get there, I think it's worth it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dorothy.
Thank you.
Any last words that you would have for our couples out there?
I think that marriage, bringing God's kingdom into a marriage, sharing your life with another person and learning how to love them through the Lord is one of the hardest things you will ever do, but it's also one of the most beautiful and rewarding things that you will ever do.
Wonderful. Would you like to say a prayer for our couples?
Sure. Yeah. God, I want to ask that you would bless every couple who is watching, that you would bring hope where there's hopelessness, that you would bring restoration where there has been hurt, that you would bring forgiveness where there has been unforgiveness, and that the power of your Holy Spirit would come in each one of these marriages. Lord, I ask that you would call people into a deeper place and then provide them with the love that they need to be present to the spouse that they have, the children that they have. And Lord, thank you for your faithfulness in that. Thank you that you show up, and thank you that you want to empower us to love. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Thank you for viewing. We'll see you next time.